So can you tell me a little bit about yourself, or your name and where you live and work?
I'm Richard Boyatzis. I'm on the faculty of Case Western Reserve University in the School of Management and in the Psychology Department and Cognitive Science Department. I'm also an adjunct faculty member at ESADA in Barcelona.
Right.
My main job is here at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, but I also go to Barcelona often.
Right. And what do you do?
I'm a professor.
Yes, and what is that? Teaching, coaching?
My main job is to do research and to teach graduate courses. I teach courses in our Master's in Positive Organization Development program, our Executive MBA, and our Executive Doctorate and the PhD programs.
Right. And coaching, how does that get into it?
I've been doing coaching since 1967.
Right.
I've been training coaches since 1970. In many years, it was for working with graduate students, then managers and executives through consulting companies, then working with alcoholics and drug addicts as peer coaches, and since coming here as a full-time faculty member in 1987, I do it as a part of all of my courses, but then also all of the courses we've developed here on how to develop a person's emotional and social and cognitive intelligence use coaching. It's one of our distinctiveness, has been since 1989.
Right.
When we started these courses on emotional, social, and cognitive intelligence development.
Yeah.
Since 2001, we've been doing a whole series of specific workshops in our executive education division on coaching. So we train coaches.
Yeah.
We train coaches in how to do the work that we do. And since 1987, we've been doing longitudinal research on the effects of coaching.
Right.
In the past 4 years, I've started doing more physiological and neurological work, research on coaching.
Right. And how did you learn coaching yourself?
I'm a therapist.
You're a therapist?
I'm trained as a psychotherapist. I'm a psychologist. I did psychotherapy for many years during the 70s with alcoholics and drug addicts in hospitals, group therapy.
Right. And positive psychology or something similar to that, how did you get into that?
I think I was doing it long before it was ever called that. For my doctoral dissertation back in 1969, I started puzzling why, I was working with David McClellan at Harvard, I started puzzling why everybody looked at affiliation motives, unconscious drives towards love and friendship, as a deficiency. And I had postulated that there was a positive side of affiliation drives, and that most of what people measured I thought was more anxiety based.
Right.
So I would say I've been looking at the positive or approach side of things since the late 60s.
Right.
When positive psychology started catching fire, I was glad because I'd been doing it all these decades.
Right. And the people that come for you to help, is that executive students, or who did you typically work with, and who do you work with now?
When?
Before you said you did a lot of coaching, and now you also had students?
Well, now I also occasionally, I do a lot of work with executives, but prior to this, when I was running the consulting companies, we worked with companies all over the world. I mean, just about, since we were one of the two groups that started the competency movement in human resources, just about every company in the world uses competencies to do work, to do their human resource work. That's what we started.
Yeah.
In 1970, formally.
Right.
We worked with militaries in the United States and other countries, large companies, small companies, not-for-profits, NGOs. So.
And the people that you're coaching or have been coaching, what issues or challenges do they want you to help them with?
One group, the largest group, are people who are either managers, executives, or leaders who would like to be more effective.
Right.
I would say that's the group that's the tens of thousands.
Yeah.
And There are others who are in a wide range of occupations, from people who want to learn to be professors, to want to learn to be consultants, to want to learn to be IT professionals, to want to learn to be doctors, nurses, dentists, you name it. I mean, we've also done it with police and fire departments, and like I said, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the U.S. Army, the British Navy. We helped to train people at the Gdansk shipyards when they formed their food buying cooperative before Lech Walesa organized them into Solidarity. We trained entrepreneurs in Tehran and Uganda and Tunisia in the 60s. So I and my colleagues have been involved in training a lot of people. And many walks of life, many countries of the world.
And if people start a coaching engagement with you or the people that you teach, what would a coaching engagement look like?
You're talking about now?
Yeah.
Well, now it's a bit different. Because now, well, I would say up until about 1996, I was still doing some consulting. So sometimes a client would have me do coaching. Since '87, when I started here, coaching has been a part of all of the graduate programs that I'm involved in. So it is, I think, one of our distinctive features that you're doing one-on-one, and we also get involved in stimulating a lot more peer coaching and team coaching. Since I started training doctoral students in 1988 here, and faculty, we have cadres of folks who learn to be coaches, and we have a whole developmental schema now where when a doctoral student starts here, whether it's in the Doctor of Management program, so they're 40, average age 49, or in the PhD program, average age more like 29, they go through my course on leadership and change, which includes a heavy dose of coaching with compassion. They go through a course often with Melvin Smith on emotional intelligence development. We have them go through our executive education courses, which there's a 7-day sequence in which they learn coaching skills and they get supervised in practicing coaching, our approach to coaching, to the positive emotional attractor, coaching with compassion. Then if they do well, according to the people watching them and supervising them, we then encourage them to volunteer, and they get paid as coaches we usually start with the part-time MBAs or part-time graduate students first. So each graduate student would have 12 to 15 people to coach in the lead program. There's a faculty supervising them. If they end up doing the first semester well, and it looks good, and the faculty supervisor thinks they've progressed, we then encourage them to do it a second time for another semester. Usually the second or third time we move them to full-time MBAs or full-time students, and if they're doing 3 of them well with supervision, we'll then have them graduate to working with the more advanced folks, the folks in their 40s, usually the Masters in OD or the EMBAs. If they do that well once or twice or 3 times, and we think they really have a knack for this, we may start to use them as an executive coach in our executive education programs. On top of, because we do a lot of those programs here, and we use coaching in all of them. If they continue to do well now with multiple audiences, and all the feedback from the clients is very positive, and the faculty supervisors are still endorsing them as really understanding and how to do this and our approach to coaching well, we might make them a master coach, which means that they start to work with us in training new coaches, because we have coaching programs. We have a training program where we coach and give a certificate in coaching with compassion. That's what the approach is called. 2 people, and we offer it in different countries. We do this in a variety of countries of the world, as well as for different companies internally, as well as open enrollment. Once people are master coaches, if they continue to do that and they're involved in some of the research on coaching, I often invite them then to become, as they develop their skills, to become faculty with us. So they start teaching the coaching program. So over the years, some of the people teaching the coaching programs now for us are people who started out as students,
Right,
you know,
right.
15 years ago.
Yeah.
So we have, you know, I think a fairly well-developed system for doing that.
Right. And what does coaching with compassion look like? Like if I wanted to start as a client, what would that look like? What would happen before the first session, in the first session, between?
Our coaching doesn't happen out of context for a development experience. I mean, so if you're asking me what does the whole development experience look like, yeah, I mean, it varies. One version of it is the lead course, the leadership course, where the first third of the course is focused on helping the person develop their personal vision.
Yeah.
And we want the personal vision developed, focusing on, and it has to be a written document at the end that they continue to rewrite. We want them to focus on what kind of life they want to be living 15 years from now,
Yeah.
what kind of person they want to be. We want them to focus on their core values, their spiritual health, their romantic health, their family health, their physical health, their contributions to the community, and usually jobs and careers is fit in there somewhere. The coaching starts early in the course when the person is developing the vision.
Right.
The second part of the course, the second third of the course, is focused on helping them develop a sense. This all follows my theory of intentional change.
Yeah.
So my intentional change theory has 5 discoveries in the process that you iteratively move people through, and that's what we're trying to do in this course, is move people through that. And coaching has an integral part of each one of these discoveries, and the courses are designed on that, have been since the first one I designed using that specific model was in the early 70s for working with alcoholics and drug addicts in hospitals. Later we developed them in the late 70s for working with managers, and since I came here in '87 we've been doing them for mostly graduate students, occasionally undergraduates, mostly graduate students. But again, our graduate students range in age from 25 to 65.
Yeah.
And now we do it a lot in these executive programs, custom programs for government, nonprofit, and for-profit, healthcare, higher education, etc. The second part of the course tries to help the person get to a point where they assess their strengths and their weaknesses. They come up with a personal balance sheet. And in the third part of the course, they try to develop a learning plan. What are they going to do to keep themselves at their vision if they're there already, or to move themselves closer to the vision? How can they use their strengths to maximize that? And what 1 or 2 weaknesses might they work on? We also get them to spend time there developing their personal board of directors, because the relationships that enable you to keep working on improving yourself or maintaining yourself if you're already at certain abilities or virtues that you'd like to maintain is something that still needs work. In that course, a person has 2, sometimes 3 coaching experiences where they're working one-on-one with one of our master coaches or doctoral students or faculty being developed. There's another course, which is the coaching course, where they take a number of one-day workshops on emotional and social intelligence, and then they come into the 4-day workshop. The 4-day workshop, which is the one where we train people to be coaches, focuses on, again, intentional change theory and the 5 stages, and we teach people at each of these stages to coach with a focus on the positive emotional attractor. But the positive emotional attractor is a psychophysiological state in which the person is neurologically, hormonally, cognitively, and perceptually more open. And I'm doing, and others working with me, the actual research, developing that and showing that. fMRI research, behavioral research, etc. The negative emotional attractor is what often people do when they try to help someone, which is they try to work on their weaknesses, their deficiencies, or what they should do. The positive attractor is working on strengths, working toward vision. To develop, a person needs both, the positive and the negative. But because negative emotions are so much stronger than positive, and they're so overwhelming in terms of the neurological aspects of it, leading to a person closing down their openness to change, you have to overemphasize the positive. So we're saying you should have more oriented towards the positive emotional attractor, which we call coaching with compassion, because it's coaching the person toward their own dreams, their values, their virtue. we feel that most of the time when people coach, they exclusively coach for compliance.
Right.
Coaching to the person, not to the person's dreams, but to what they want the person to do. Whether it's a parent, a spouse, a manager, a teacher, a coach, a cleric, you know, a rabbi, minister, priest, imam. Unfortunately, when you coach for compliance, you activate the negative emotional attractor, which activates the sympathetic nervous system, which in heavy doses doesn't help. It leads to cognitive impairment, perceptual impairment, emotional impairment. So what we do is we teach people to coach to the positive emotional attractor, not excluding the negative because it's needed. It's actually, you die if you didn't. You need to work on these things. You have to activate the organism and you have to protect the organism. I mean, if you don't engage in some of these negative activities, you actually will get eaten or destroyed.
Yeah.
So what we do though is we teach people to overemphasize the positive because people will go toward the negative anyway.
Yeah.
Almost everybody's socialized to do that.
Yeah.
And they think that's what they should do. So what we have to do is train people how to overcompensate.
Right.
So that's why we call it coaching with compassion. In the coaching course, which is 2 days and then 2 days, 6 weeks later, a person goes through the lead course, but they're always going through it at 2 levels. They're going through parts of it themselves, doing my own vision, doing my own assessment, doing my own personal balance sheet, doing my own learning plan, and you're learning to coach others with this 3 to 6 PEA to 1 NEA ratio, and we do it through a whole series of what we call real plays. In other words, instead of role plays, which are artificial, we actually have people in trios where they're doing a round robin of coaching each other in sequence about that person's vision.
Right.
So in the real plays, these hour-and-a-half modules, a person gets a chance to be a coach, to coach, for example, in the first one, coach person B's vision on the real vision. Person B is getting coached about his or her vision, and person C is watching it and then leads a discussion, a critique discussion.
Right.
Which also has to manage 3 to 6 PEA to 1 NEA in the debrief. And then they rotate that. Well, they go through 5 of those cycles of real plays during our 4 days of sessions. Meanwhile, in the action learning assignments in between, they're having one-on-one coaching sessions with our master coach, and they're having another peer coaching session with other people who are in the class. That's the second form of it in terms of course. There's a third course we do, which is one that I do, in which I'm teaching with the various graduate programs. The average age of my students is about 44, so they usually are very well experienced. They fly in for these events from all over the world because the classes tend to happen about once every 6 weeks. And what happens is, if they've had the lead course before in their program, then I don't have them do the vision again. If they haven't, I have them work on the vision again. But either way, I have them do a second major assignment in which, as they learn about all of this, the neurological issues, the perceptual issues, the behavioral, the techniques, they actually are supposed to go out and practice coaching with compassion. So the assignment is to find 2 people who are outstanding performers and to coach them into the PEA, the positive emotional attractor, and keep them there for an hour. It's not a full coaching thing, and I tell people that, but the one weak spot, the one thing most people don't comfortably do in doing what I think is a more effective approach to coaching is they don't have as much facility of keeping a person pulled back into the PEA, because people often will tip into the NEA just instinctively. So part of what I'm doing in this assignment is telling them to find 2 people who are outstanding performers, because as I say to them, I don't want you to have any even unconscious desire to fix them. Because it makes it harder.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to help you learn something which isn't a natural skill. I mean, I think it's a natural human process, but as soon as we get experienced in work, we get distorted.
Yeah.
So to help you with that, I want you to overemphasize it for this assignment. Then they have to write up each case, and they have to critique them in terms of the concepts and the readings in the course. And then I critique their critique, and sometimes I have them redo it if they didn't do it well, and sometimes I have them do more of the analysis and all that. So we have, I would say, 3 different actual standing courses, two of which are offered to people in organizations and governments and companies and nonprofits. They're also offered as a part of our graduate degree programs, and the other one is just for folks in the graduate degree programs. The positive emotional attractor is activated in a human being when you talk about their dreams, not their possibilities, not their probabilities. So that's why very often one of the questions is, let me ask you, Ebbett, you know, if your life were absolutely perfect 10 to 15 years from now, you know, it's years after you've got your doctorate, what's it like? If everything were absolutely ideal, what would your life be like 15 years from now?
Right. So that would be one of the questions to keep.
Yeah, and then I would ask you to start to describe that.
Yeah.
And then as you start to describe it, part of my role is to bring it out. So I'm trying to, as we say in the training, bring your vision to consciousness. And as you explore different parts of it, I might ask you questions to bring other parts to consciousness. So if you start to say where you might be living, I'll say, okay, who are you living with?
Right.
If you haven't mentioned it, I'll say, are you doing any kind of work? What kind of work? So I'll draw this out, because the second thing we want to do in the vision is, as the person develops more consciousness about their vision, to bring it to the surface, I then want to, or we want to, get a person to figure out which are the more salient parts of it. What are the parts that really are important to me? So if you think about what are the parts that are really exciting, we want you to sort that out. Because otherwise the person says, well, I want to do all these 15 or 25 things, but really there's certain of them that are very important.
Yeah.
Then we try to make sure the third leg of the process for the vision is to make sure that it's holistic.
Right.
That you've covered all parts of yourself as a human being. That's one technique for coaching with compassion. Often if you start that process, an hour goes by like that.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I work with executives, if I've worked with, very often this happens when people are CEO types, I need multiple sessions with them around the vision, because they've spent so much time thinking about their work. All they want to do is talk about, well, what they're going to do next. I said, I don't care about that right now. What I want to talk about is 10 to 15 years from now. If the person is older, like over 75 or 80, I might not use 10 to 15 years, because that might be indelicate. If the person is in a hospital, if we're working with patients and they have cancers or other really serious problems, I might not use this 10 to 15 years, but I would shift the vision to talking about what values are important to you, what kind of person do you want to be.
Right.
So we get people talking about what kind of, in a sense, virtues they aspire to.
Right.
We also use this with younger people, but with, like I said, people over 75 or people who are having serious or life-threatening diseases, you may or may not, it depends on the individual and the situation. Another way to arouse compassion, because we're trying to arouse the parasympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
And there are only four well-studied, I shouldn't say well-studied, there are only 4 ways that have been documented in medical research to activate the parasympathetic nervous system directly.
Right.
There may be others.
Yeah.
People are doing research all the time to find others. But there are 4 that have a lot of data on it. So one is through hope, and that's where the vision comes in.
Yeah.
One is through mindfulness. And while we can try to encourage a person to meditate or do yoga in the coaching session, that's a little odd. So what we try to do in mindfulness in the coaching session is to get them to think about their core values, how they feel in different settings, tuning in, how they experience other people's feelings. Another technique is to use compassion or gratitude. So one of the questions, one of the exercises we ask people is to think about who helped them in their life. I actually have in many of my even half-day or 2-hour lectures or classes. I used it at the Harvard conference. I get people to do a relational lifeline.
Yeah.
In other words, most people do a resume in terms of what are my experiences or what have I accomplished. I think another way to describe your life is who have you interacted with that's been meaningful.
Yeah.
So I have people chunk the years or stages of their life, and I say, okay, what people were helpful to you in each of those places? They write a lot of names. Then I say, okay, go back and circle the 5 that were the most helpful across your life. Become who you are or get to where you are. Then I have them think of specific moments. And when we draw that out, it almost always draws out a deep sense of gratitude, which sets off the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what we want. But it also gets them, and part of that is they get into this part where you activate the default mode network in the brain, which opens a person up to new possibilities.
Yeah.
So not only are they open to new feelings, but they're cognitively thinking much more complexly about the possibilities of the future.
Right.
It's part of why we want to stay away from forecasting or probabilities, because then people analyze it. And we want to move out of the analytic mode into this other mode. Sometimes if a person's having difficulty with this and we want to get them into the future visioning, we might use, in the workbook that we have that was published in 2008, we have, I think, 20 exercises to help a person provoke elements of their personal vision. Some of them are simple, like, tell me what you wish people would say at your funeral. What's your legacy? Do you feel a compelling passion in life? Is there something you feel a calling toward? Do you have a noble purpose? What is it? What are 27 things you want to do or experience before you die? If you had a magical process that you could go through that could give you the skills and physical capability and knowledge to do anything you'd like in the world and takes care of your responsibilities and your families for 2 years, what jobs would you love to try? Different things to provoke fantasy.
Right.
If you won 50 million euros in the lottery after tax, how would your work or life change? So the exercises sometimes are very deep. Who helped me the most? Remember some key moments. What did they say or do? How did it make you feel? Others are more self-reflective. What are my key values? We have a test on helping people sort out their operating philosophy. Others are more playful, like the calling, purpose, bucket list.
Right. And you mentioned test. Which assessments do you use?
Well, assessments in the sense of exercises.
Right.
We have a whole bunch of exercises that we've been using since 1990. See, when we started this process of designing the leadership course in particular, we launched it as a required part of our MBA program in 1990. We now have 25 longitudinal studies of entering versus graduating MBA students, even several studies of people out 5 years and 7 years for the part-time students, 2 years after they graduated with some of them, in which we're studying, are they developing their emotional and social and cognitive competencies? And we've picked the competencies that are very important to effectiveness in management, executive, and leadership functioning, which also helps in most professions. And we're assessing them in this course. So one of the many tests that we used in this process, now we've boiled it down mostly, although we use videotapes of group simulations and audios of critical incidents from work. The majority of the assessment we use is the 360 that Dan Goldman and I developed, called the Emotional and Social Competency Inventory.
Right.
But it's the 360 part of it that's really important, because we want, for the assessment of people's competencies, we want informant's views. So although the self-assessment is a part of the coaching discussion, we actually take the thing most seriously in terms of how others see the person.
Right.
If the person is under 35, coming through one of our, like the MBA program, we give them video exercises, because often people that age 30, 28 haven't seen themselves operating, and they need the video feedback.
Yeah.
How do you operate in a task group? How do you do a presentation? My experience is that by the time people get to their late 30s, they've seen themselves on video. They don't need the video feedback. But the assessment for the strengths and weaknesses, which is what I'm talking about now, is different than the assessment for the vision. Although there are some tests involved, they're more really exercises for self-insight.
Right.
And for the coach to work with the person around processing. Because very often, the coach will not just look at the person's essay about their vision, they'll also ask them to bring in all of their documents on the exercises. Because there are times in which a coach will see a pattern through the exercises that the student or the coachee won't.
Right. And so how what does the coach do about it? Like when they have made a self-assessment or the 360 or.
What do you mean? What does the coach do?
So the.
Well, if they do the 360, now we're into the assessment part
Yeah.
of the real self, not the ideal self, because
Yeah.
in the intentional change theory,
Yeah.
it's the second discovery. We will only give people data back once they've written and talked about the vision with the coach.
Yeah.
This is a very important part of our process, because it is my perception that most of the time, coaching and training and management education doesn't result in sustained change because the person feels they should change. It's like telling people to exercise more and eat less, or in Europe telling them not to smoke.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't work. Well, the reason it doesn't work is because it feels imposed.
Yeah.
So our sense is the important issue is to get that vision done first.
Right. Yeah.
And hopefully you're opening the person up to the possibilities. You're getting them to think, what do I really want? Not what my parents, not what my spouse, not what my teachers say, not what my manager says, what do I want? Then we can go into the assessment.
Right.
Now often we've collected the assessment before that, we just don't give it back to someone.
Right.
When we give them back the 360, we teach them about the categories and the items and the scales and things like that. And we give them the results. We often give them time to work through, and we have worksheets that they can do to start processing it. And then they, after they think they've processed it a bit, they sit with the coach to talk about, what do I see in the data? Now let me come back to that, because the coaching process in there is very important, the way we do it toward the PEA also. And then they sit with colleagues in these peer groups and discuss their assessments. So they're getting context. If a person is married and they have a good relationship with their spouse or partner, we suggest that the person talks to them about it as well. If they don't have a good relationship, we say don't do it because it can make things worse.
Right.
In the coaching session around the assessment data, we emphasize that your job as a coach is to help articulate, identify, and reinforce their strengths, first and foremost. Then to help them see a few weaknesses, if there are any. I mean, if a person, like sometimes our 50, 60-year-old executives will come in, and even on the 360, they're doing everything perfectly, which is why they've been so successful. Not perfectly, but very well, very frequently. In which case, very often, then the challenge with them is, how do you maintain it?
Right.
Because if you don't maintain it, the stress of work and life will drag you down.
Yeah.
That's what we call move you into dissonance. So what I say to coaches that we're training and how we train them is, if you only had 1 hour to coach someone, not the multiple things that we think is really important, because relationship building is a key part of coaching.
Yeah.
But if somehow it was weird and you only had 1 hour, you should spend 30 minutes on the vision, 20 minutes on the strengths, 5 minutes on the weaknesses, and 5 minutes on the learning plan.
Right.
That's what we say is the relative emphasis. So, I mean, ideally, you should never be in a situation with a 1 hour coaching.
No.
But what we're trying to say is, that's what you should have in your head as the model for how you spend your time in your interaction.
Right.
Now, part of it is, again, we're trying to work toward this positive emotional attractor, what we're calling coaching with compassion. Part of it is, we think people will bring the negative into it.
Yeah.
It's not like you have to work at that. So, in fact, because although you need both the positive and the negative, what we're doing is overemphasizing the positive to counterbalance what the person will almost naturally do.
Right.
Now, in rare cases, really rare cases, where a person will only look at the positive, then you have to find a way to introduce the negative emotional attractor.
Right.
Because if a person's only positive, they'll make bad investment decisions, they'll get surprised. I mean, there are all sorts of data now coming out showing that that's really very dysfunctional.
And how can you do that? How can you help a person become more focused, analytic, or in the negative emotional attractor?
Well, again, I think the easy way to do it is, if you have videotape, you ask them, well, how are you coming across? Are you coming across in a way you like to be coming across to other people? Simple question. I mean, seldom do I meet people who say, oh yes, I love the way I look.
Right.
But if a person does say that, oh, I'm fantastic, and I'm looking at the video and think, Jesus, they're an ass. You know, what the hell's the person think? I would start to ask other questions like, have other people told you that you come across, really positively in the way you're talking about it? And they might talk to, has your spouse or partner ever said anything about that? Well, managers, performance reviews, collecting data from what their experiences are. Unless a person is a sociopath or is really suffering from some form of autism, they've had feedback somewhere along the line that it's not working. So part of what I'm doing is bringing that back into the conversation and saying, well, what sense do you make of that? Now again, I mean, I don't feel like we have to hit people on this because people do enough damage to themselves. But I do think at times if a person is too positive, part of our job is to help them with a little bit of the balance. Now what I suggest to people on the 360 is, again, as a rule of thumb, you should make sure that if you do 1 hour coaching on the assessment data, we try to get them to work up a personal balance sheet. What are my strengths, what are my distinctive strengths, what are my weaknesses, and what are my enduring dispositions, the weaknesses that I'll never change. I try to get a person to process that and think about it beforehand. Whether they do or not, once you're sitting there with the 360 and the commentary on the 360, not just the empirical, the quantitative, and you're drawing out, we invite people to bring in data from their performance reviews, from other assessments, to try to make a whole sense of them. We encourage on the 360 people to have people at work to fill it out, their boss, peers, subordinates, customers or clients. We also encourage them to have their spouse or partner fill it out, adult friends, and if they have adult children, fine. I stay away from parents because parents will either be all negative or all positive. And they tend to not really help. And if the children are not over 30, if they're young children, 20 or something like that, they'll again tend to be all negative or all positive. We encourage them to have adult friends complete it. So we'll have people collect data from 15 or 20 people. I've had one who was an overachiever. She collected data from 67 people. I thought that was a bit much, but there are times in which, various times, depending on the course and what we're doing, we'll use my best self exercise. Where people go out and interview people qualitatively. Tell me about a time in which I was at my best, and you write, and we'll get them to collect that from 15 or 20 people, and then analyze it for your strengths and what are the themes and patterns. If we don't have the best self exercise, the coach is trying to do that. So if the only thing you have is this person's balance sheet draft and the data in front of you, what I'm suggesting to coaches is see if you can find at least 3 strengths through all the data. Sometimes the strengths might be individual competencies. Oh, you are really great at teamwork. The data shows it from all these other people around you. Sometimes the data is across competencies. Boy, in every competency where it has to do with you exciting other people, inspirational leadership, coaching and mentoring, influence, you are fantastic. So there are different ways to look at how you could help them sort out a strength. I also think it's useful that a person has 1 or 2 things they might want to work on at the end of that conversation. I suggest in our teaching, we suggest that people not let it go beyond that. If a person identifies 3 things they want to work on, probably they're not going to. And again, it's because if a person starts to feel overwhelmed by the weaknesses, they're just going to get depressed, closed, defensive, and not work at all. So again, the 3-to-1, 4-to-1 ratio is a good one to keep in mind. The coaching is a process of building a relationship, of getting in tune with the other person and they with you. And if you're doing that well, not only are you helping them with the positive emotional attractor, but in the here and now, you're stimulating this parasympathetic nervous system. And when the other person feels it, you feel it. So one of the things that it does is it helps the people who are doing the coaching renew. Matter of fact, in a 2006 article that Melvin Smith and Nancy Blaze and I published in the Academy of Management Learning and Education Journal, we made the argument that all leaders should be coaches and coach with compassion, not to develop other people, but to renew themselves.
Right, yeah.
To help themselves be more emotionally and cognitively and physically sustainable.
Right.
So there is an interaction that is very important in the here and now process. It's one of the reasons why I don't think a coaching relationship can happen entirely at a distance. There has to be some moment in which you meet each other. Now, if you physically can't, because we have coaches who coach people in other countries, Scotland, New Zealand, Abu Dhabi, etc. There are times in which you have to do it over video Skype, but I do think it's better if you have at least one face-to-face interaction where you can smell each other's pheromones, in a sense. It allows more direct contact. If you're going to coach at a distance, I think video, Skype or Uvu or something, Adobe Connect, is much better than just audio. Audio's okay, audio's better than email. When, like in our Leadership Deep Dive program, where people are get a coach that they work with for a year, so it's not just around the courses, it's also continuing. I encourage people to try to use a mixture of things and keep it varied. You know, if you can, some face-to-face, some video, electronic, some audio, some touching base with email. The idea is to keep moving in and out of the different media, because each one helps to create a different part of the relationship.
Right.
But in that process, to go back to the personal balance sheet, part of the delicate issue is you're trying to help somebody figure out which weakness might be important to them, but they might also be able to work on.
Right.
So I ask people to think about a weakness that's close to the tipping point. The tipping point is a concept between the PEA and NEA, but the other way to use the tipping point is how frequently do you use your assets, your talents, and the tipping point is when you're not using them enough to be outstanding in your work or your family life, and you tip into using them frequently enough or appropriately enough so you're able to be effective.
Right.
So what I suggest is find a weakness close to the tipping point. So if somebody's coaching me at this stage of my life and they say, well, you have to exercise a lot more, you know, I'm going to say, yeah. You know, I've been having people telling me that for 30 years. That's not close to a tipping point. But there are things a person could work with me on that's close to the tipping point, and I'd say, okay, I can work on that. So then in the last part of the process that we outline in terms of the intentional change theory, a person is turning this into a learning agenda, learning plan. But even there, we say, please, there's going to be enough stress in moving toward this stuff. First of all, the learning plan might be all focused on maintaining your current success and vision, if you're there. If you need to move toward your vision, we want you to be using your strengths. If you have to work on a weakness here and there, fine, but remember the balance issue. So it's not one-on-one. But the activities that you're to engage in on the learning plan can't be a performance improvement plan. Because my observation is that every time you do a performance improvement plan, people slip into, I should do this, and that's the negative emotional attractor. That induces guilt. You start building up stress, you start defending, close down. So what we're emphasizing, I'm not saying we're always able to do it, but what we aspire to is to help them identify things in the learning agenda that they look forward to in a joyful way. Boy, I would love to be working on that. I would love to try this. And if a person doesn't feel that way about it, they're not going to do it for more than a few weeks. Why waste your time and their time? So part of the importance of the relationship with the coach is because you're trying to help somebody achieve and articulate and refresh their commitment to their personal vision, but you're also helping them with some modification or morphing process, which has to be steady, deliberate, but easy. Because if it's very difficult, the person won't do it. So one of the things that I think, as Ellen Van Oosten has showed in her research, a desirable outcome of the coaching process, or what do I think makes one set of relationships and interactions where I might say, well, that's an effective coaching relationship, is that the person is able to enhance or recommit to an ideal self or personal vision. And sometimes they have to create it because they don't have it. a person is able to morph or modify something and either maintain behavior that they're doing now that's important, or if they're out of work-life balance, to achieve a little bit better, or to find a closer relationship with their spouse or partner where they're laughing more, or whatever it is that they need to change on. So there is some change in the ideal self, or maintenance. There is some maintenance or change in the real self, and there's an improvement in the quality of the relationship with the coach, because that, I think, is one of the three desired outcomes.
Right, right. And how can that be an outcome? The last one.
Well, do we have a relationship or not? Do I continue to see you as somebody I could turn to?
Right, right, right. Because
have I developed a resonance? We use that language, resonance, to say, are we in tune with each other?
Right.
And that's why I think all too often coaching and mentoring, which I see as a subset of coaching, by the way, isn't very effective, is because people get into an instrumental mode. Well, if you need a contact, that's networking, that's not coaching. And we don't have a relationship. But if I'm really to be helpful to you, we have to build a relationship, because nothing is a one-time event.
Right, 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 okay. Yeah, Ellen also mentioned the thing about the relationship, but I had difficulties understanding that as an outcome, not as the cause of the outcomes.
Well, it's both.
Yeah.
But I'm also saying it should be one of the dependent variables when people do research on effective coaching.
Right, right, yeah, okay, yeah.
Because if a person doesn't have some effective relationships, I don't think their progress on these other things will be sustainable.
Right, right.
We can't do this alone.
Right, 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 right. Okay. What about, you've mentioned exercises, and in positive psychology there is the concept of positive interventions. Do you use certain interventions or exercises? Like 3 good things, using strengths in new ways and stuff like that?
Yes, we use all of those. I encourage people, if they don't meditate or pray, I encourage them to pursue some practice there. If they need to be more active, then I might encourage them to explore Tai Chi or yoga. I encourage people to find some physical exercises or sports that are good for them. I encourage them to spend time with each member of their immediate family. If they have children, with each child separately as well as together, their spouse or partner, doing things that are fun. I encourage people to go out and volunteer in the community, to do things for people who are less fortunate. And many times people are already doing it, so I don't really have to encourage them much of the coaching, but these are all parts of this more holistic thing. And when we get to a point where we're helping a person construct this learning agenda and learning plan, we come back to the comprehensive vision. Say, okay, what are you doing to help achieve this better relationship with your spouse or your partner? What are you doing to maintain it if you have a good relationship? Right. Things like that. You were asking the question, how do I deal with my colleagues or students, not in the coaching situation, but otherwise? How do these concepts play?
Yeah.
Do I use them? And my hope is, my aspiration is, I use them all the time. Now, I'm not saying there aren't days in which I have a bad day. Okay, I occasionally do. But as I mentioned to you, I have all these photographs in my office because they make it easy for us to start conversations.
Yeah.
They remind anyone who comes into my office that there is a world outside, and mostly it's about nature and very funny or pleasant things or interesting things. So, and the use of music in my office, typically, not when I'm recording interviews, but otherwise, is all around both keeping other people in here and myself in a positive emotional attractor. Because the things we're going to talk about often, whether it's theory or research or going for grants or somebody who's worried about somebody else, are negative and intense enough.
Right.
So what I try to do is create more of this all the time. So even when I'm not quote unquote coaching, I'm coaching.
Right, yeah, yeah.
I mean, my entire life is helping.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether I'm effective or not is another issue.
Right.
You have to talk to my students or my friends and other colleagues. But I would say even in my emails, I try to mention a number of positive things. Even when I'm giving feedback on a student's paper, I really try hard to look for, hopefully I don't have to try that hard, to look for a number of positive things. And I talk about the positive things before I get to if there's anything I think that they need to work on.
Right.
And I try to phrase the things they need to work on as something that would help them understand another person better.
Right, right.
So I try to put it in a context which they've already said is important to them.
Right, right.
There are times in which I might lose my patience, but
right.
I try not to.
Yeah. What about when you try to help other people in a coaching way? Do you sometimes share your knowledge of these concepts?
All the time. I think it's part of the process. No, I think that if you're trying to help someone, you have to be transparent about the process. I mean, I can't make it like, oh, well, I'm subtly doing this thing, because, then how is that different than just slipping people, date rape drugs and other ridiculous things that allow you to abuse someone? So I think if we're to be ethical about this, we have to be transparent about our models and about the research.
Right.
And this is something that's very important to me, because there are a lot of people who proselytize or promote a particular approach to coaching.
Yeah.
And my answer to people at conferences and other things, or when they email me, I'll say, ask them for the evidence. Do they have evidence that it works? And if they don't, then keep that in context. Doesn't mean that what they're doing isn't good, but caveat emptor. And I think that one of the reasons I think it's important doing this kind of research on a regular basis is, I think, at a university or in consultancies where we promote a lot of these ideas, we should be doing research on a regular basis to check and see whether or not it's working.
Yeah.
And it can't be research just to affirm it. And that's one of the things you have to be careful of. I mean, if it's going to be credible research, it has to be done in a way in which you could be proved false.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then I think you're working with an intellectual integrity.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that's part of what people should know.
And how would you do it in a coaching session? How would you be transparent? Like, when would you introduce a concept, and how would you introduce it?
Well, remember, when I and all the people working with me are doing coaching, it's in the context of courses.
Yeah.
Now, some are degree courses, some are executive courses, but it's always in a course.
But how would
So they're getting the concepts in the classes.
And how would they use the concepts when they sit in front of a client? Like, how would they introduce it to the client?
You mean when we're training people in the coaching program?
So, for instance, in the action learning where they go out and...
when they do the coaching with compassion.
Yeah.
I give them a briefing as to, there's a short way to introduce it and there's a long way.
Yeah.
The short way is to say, we're experimenting with some new techniques in this course I'm taking that you know about, and it's about trying to help people improve. You want to go along with it. The longer one is where they actually lay out the model, they lay out the research. I encourage them to give people articles or the books. Very often, people use, depending upon the learning style of the person being coached, they might want the model at the beginning. So I give them the actual model. Sometimes if they're very technical and they're a little nerdy, they give them some of the research.
Right.
I mean, what I tell them is, you have to judge this according to the person you're coaching.
Yeah.
Because some people have a more abstract learning style, in which case they want to see the model up front before they can get into it. Other people are more concrete. They just want to see the model emerge.
Right. I also have a question about flexibility, because one of the principles in evidence-based coaching is kind of to adapt the way you work to fit the person and the context.
Definitely.
And can you say something about that? Your thoughts?
It's a good thing.
Right. Why is it a good thing?
Why is it a good thing?
Yeah.
Because what I just said, people have different learning styles. I mean, just for example, one thing, people have different learning styles. So if a person's concrete in their learning preference, you're going to approach them a different way than if they're abstract.
Yeah.
In one case, they're more inductive, in another case, they're more deductive.
Yeah.
Not only that, but people have different philosophical orientations. If a person's more pragmatic, you better pitch the coaching towards how they could use it.
Yeah.
If a person's more humanistic, it's going to be about how they can be with other people that they're close to. If they're more intellectual in their philosophical orientation, they're going to want to understand the models.
Yeah.
So you've got learning style differences, you've got philosophical orientations, you've got Myers-Briggs differences in interpersonal style. You've got all sorts of differences in ethnic, racial, religious differences, or spiritual that might affect things.
Yeah.
Gender differences, age differences, social class. I think, and then on top of that, you have other kinds of things like, does the person have some neurological disorder or not?
Yeah.
Is the person coming out of a situation in which they've been terrified? Is the person having a bad time at work? Is the person having a good time at work? I mean, I would say, it's an infinite number of things that a person has to consider. I think that's one of the reasons why really effective coaching relationships don't happen with people easily, and it takes experience, it takes a lot of practice. Because if you try to do this analytically, you're going to be there forever figuring out what you're going to do. So what you have to do is build up an experience base that you can work with. Either if it's in a course and they're filling out these instruments, you could see the results in advance, but often you don't have that luxury. So you have to be able to use cues in your discussion to see where they're lighting up, where they're leaning in, where they're more interested, where they're kind of going like this, which you know is not a good sign. So I think that a coach has to be very thoughtful about who the person is and what their state is. In this coaching with compassion assignment, one of the reasons I pulled for some mindfulness, I asked them to describe at the beginning of each session their mood and the mood of the coach, the person being coached. And then I asked them to document it during the process, what's going back and forth. And then I asked them to talk about the mood at the end. Part of what I'm doing is just getting them to be more mindful, more tuned into it. And what I find is that as people become more and more effective coaches, this all becomes intuitive. It becomes unconscious.
Right. And the clients who experience coaching with compassion, what do they give as feedback? What do they say is most helpful?
First of all, if a person doesn't volunteer how they're doing, how they're making sense of what they're experiencing, the coach should be periodically asking. Right, yeah. How are you doing? Does this make sense? How do you feel? Yeah. Is this okay? I think that's a part of the back and forth. I think that a coach has to be in tune with the other person, which means you have to be monitoring it before, during, and after the coaching session. Yeah. How do people react to these things? It's the complete spectrum, of course. But if it's working well, people are feeling new insight. They feel moved. You see them leave more excited. That very often you could see a spark when all of a sudden they say, wow, especially around the vision. That, I hadn't thought of that before, or that's fantastic, or this helps me articulate something I've been, thinking about or mulling about for a while. Those are kind of statements that say to me, okay, we're helping with the vision. Right. With the personal balance sheet, the kind of statements that tell me we're helping with it, if a person says, wow, that makes sense. That helps me understand some of the feedback I've been getting. I really do that well, and I often don't recognize it. Right. Those kind of statements. And if it's a learning agenda, it's, you're reading all the facial and other things. Is the person looking forward to it? Right. And how can you tell whether the person is progressing? Like, do you use assessment? You should be talking to them. So by asking? Yes. I think most of the time, periodically, what often people call checking in. Yeah. How's it going? Yeah. Is fine. It's enough. My guess is at some periodic level, you should remind them more thoroughly, how's it going on your learning agenda, on the vision. What often happens with me is people tell me that before I even ask. Yeah. Because, it's their life, so it's more in their framework. We only use formal assessments, repeat assessments, when we're doing empirical research, or if the client the individual or the system wants us to provide, after a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, do they want another assessment? So with the MBAs, we actually have what's called an exit assessment.
Right.
So they do a lot of this 360 coming in as a part of the assessment. Well, we also have them do it going out before they leave.
Yeah.
So they can compare how they've done.
Right.
And they compare it to because they're doing self-assessment as well as others. We have them do some video stuff, so they can be comparing and contrasting. I think when you have a program that you want people to recognize that they're making progress, which often is a challenge with younger people.
Yeah.
Younger being under 40. Or less experienced may be more important than younger. That's the relevant issue. They might need some help seeing the evidence.
Right.
Because, we know, for example, there's a gender difference. I mean, men will tend to think they're making more progress than they are. Women will tend to think they're making less progress than they are.
Right.
So some of it is that, and sometimes we do that as a way to kind of reinforce it. I don't think it's really all that important, because I think a person is pretty good at knowing whether or not they're moving ahead in their life, in their work.
Right.
Is their relationship to their spouse or their partner better?
Yeah. And what do you think causes the progress that you see? Like, what could be some of the mechanisms that are causing the progress?
What facilitates a better development or articulation of a person's personal vision? One of the 3 outcomes I talked about. We now have one fMRI study, and we're about to start another one in a few weeks, actually, in which we are looking at the techniques of coaching to the PEA versus NEA, and we believe we've seen documented in research on the coaching sessions how the language will go more positive in the PEA, negative in the NEA. That was Anita Howard's thesis. She showed that with mid-career dentists. We look at some of these things in terms of the quality of the improvement. We have research going on right now. Is their actual vision improving before and after? We've got a number of studies going on right now about that. Yeah. But one of them that we're making a lot of progress on is understanding the neural mechanisms. And if it continues to go in the way it has in terms of the results, then what it says is, if you bring a person into this parasympathetic nervous system state, they're more open.
Yeah.
They will develop a fuller vision for their life. They will consider more parts of their vision.
Yeah.
They'll be more excited about the vision. They'll be more holistic about the vision. So the mechanism is bringing them into this neuroendocrine process where they can consider possibilities.
Right.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
By causal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
so on the changes in the real self, if a person changes some aspect of their behavior, which is one of the 3 I said called desired outcomes.
Yeah.
Now, it could be the conditions of their lives. So people will call me and say, I said that I wanted to leave the world of consulting and go into academia. I'm now teaching adjunct at George Washington University, 1 course a year. Yeah. And they call me 2 years later and say, they just offered me a full-time job.
Right.
But those are clear evidence.
Yeah.
With the changes in the real self, I think the evidence is things that have happened that are consistent with either movement toward the person's vision or some of the desired things in their learning agenda, learning plan.
I don't understand. How can that be causes or mechanisms? I don't understand.
The mechanism is the learning plan. The feedback that they've achieved it is the evidence.
Yeah. Okay.
The mechanism is the coaching to the PEA in each of these stages. Toward the ultimate outcome of the quality of the relationship, that's easy. Does the person call you back?
Yeah, right.
Do they ask, do they want to touch base?
Yeah.
Do they send you an email?
Right.
And the ultimate one, when doing this for a living is, are they willing to continue paying you?
Yeah. And Some research, especially in psychotherapy, seems to suggest that a lot of the variance in outcome is explained by things happening outside of the psychotherapy session. And
well, and that's not as relevant in coaching, because in coaching you're not trying to help a person in that session deal with the whole thing. You're trying to facilitate what they're doing in their life. So you're not, I mean, I don't think anybody would ever attribute the entire reason why something happened to the coaching. The coaching might have helped.
Yeah.
And if you have good research, then you should be able to show that the coaching helped X% or something or other. But hopefully other things happen.
Yeah.
Whether it's the well-being of people willing to help them, other people, or is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you do something in the session to help facilitate that things going outside of the session going on? Like building their relationship with other people?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Part of it is we continue to ask them to talk about each of these things with trusted friends,
right.
their loved ones. I love Kathy Cram from Boston University's notion of a developmental network. We have a different variation on it, but it's the same thing. And I got the idea from her, but I just changed the framework, and we call it a personal board of directors.
Right.
So who are the 5 or 7 people that you want to regularly touch base with around these things? We suggest people do that around their vision. We suggest they do it around their learning plan. And we suggest they touch base with them periodically, because then it tends to be more of a mutual thing. It's really peer coaching more than anything else. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes if it's a therapist, or if it's a minister or an imam or a rabbi, or it might not be back and forth. It might be more one way.
Right.
But we strongly urge people to have these conversations. When I'm doing the coaching or teaching these classes with anybody who's over 38, 35 years old or so, I suggest if they are married or have a partner and the relationship is going well, that they have them fill out the same exercises around the vision.
Yeah.
And they talk about each person's vision, and then they start to articulate a shared vision.
Yeah.
I've done that with executives where we coach the couple, not just the individuals.
Right. And what about you? How do you develop as a professional yourself? Do you have a coach?
Oh yeah. Quite a few people who I have that kind of relationship with.
Right.
My wife is one.
Right.
I mean, she's helped me for decades, and I still talk to her. I've got a number of people, close friends that I've been with for, I've had as close friends for 40 years or so, that I touch base with on different kinds of things. I've got folks here, colleagues, that are, then sometimes they're junior to me. But if I have the quality relationship, one of the people who I consider one of my coaches is one of my doctoral students.
Right.
But I've known her for 15 years, no more than that, almost 20 years now. She's been a student, she's been a colleague, she was actually my boss at one point when she was running things in executive education.
Right.
Ellen.
Yeah. And when you learn something new, how do you integrate it in the way that you coach other people?
Well, this is one thing that may be odd, because my entire job is learning.
Yeah.
I'm a professor, I'm a research professor.
Yeah.
So my entire life is focused on learning all of this stuff. And since the essence of what all of my work is about is sustained desired change, and how do you help it, and I see whatever forms of coaching or teaching or doctor-patient or all these things as a part of that, I would say everything I do becomes a part of the continual churn of, how is this working? What does this mean? How does this article apply? How does this research over there go? What does that mean? How does it affect the theory? How does it affect the research? How does it affect the practice? So it's constantly going through a metamorphosis.
Right.
I would hope.
Yeah. And how does it affect the practice? Like how do you change your model or the way you talk to people or?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think 10 years ago I was anywhere near as clear. I didn't even use, 10 years ago, I wasn't even using the positive negative emotional attractor concept.
Okay, right.
We were doing the same things,
Right.
but I didn't have that language.
Okay. Yeah.
6 years ago, I didn't have the neuroscience.
Right.
I hadn't done the studies. I had done some of the reading, but nowhere near as much of the reading as I've done now.
Right.
This keeps changing things. It keeps helping me refine things.
Right.
So 35 years ago, as a part of the model, we had people developing plans with measurable objectives and action steps and anticipating obstacles. Now, you know, as a result of various research, Annie McKee, who did one of her co-authors on these books, when she was doing her doctoral program in it was 88 or 87 to 90, her thesis was on different ways people plan. That changed how I look at the planning process.
Right.
I realized as a result of her research that if people plan in different ways, and not everybody likes setting specific goals, this is crazy. By us requiring measurable time-phased goals, we're forcing compliance, which is going the other way.
Right. That's what most coaches do.
Yeah, and it works for the small percentage of the population that are highly achievement driven.
Right. That's very interesting. So what about positive psychology coaching? Some people use that term, positive psychology coaching. What do you think about that?
It's okay, if it works for you.
And what do you call what you're doing?
Coaching.
Just coaching, or coaching with compassion?
Well,
or?
I mean, if somebody says, what's your technique? I'll say, well, we're coaching to the positive emotional attractor, or I'll sometimes call it coaching for compassion, because I want to make the coaching with compassion the distinction vis-a-vis coaching for compliance.
Right, okay, right. Right.
But yes, sorry, you didn't ask this question quite that way, but if you had said, do I consider myself a part of the positive psychology movement? Yes, I do.
Right. And are there things that we've not talked about but that are important to understand, for me to understand the way that you work? You said it would take such a long time to kind of get the whole picture. Are there things that we have not talked about that you've left out but that are important to...
Because it really hasn't come up, although a few moments we lapsed into it, I think playfulness is very important.
Yeah.
So I think introducing humor is an important part of a relationship building process, but it also helps people go into the positive emotional attractor.
So can you say something more about that?
Yeah, I like to help people laugh periodically.
And how do you do that?
Say something that seems funny.
Yeah.
Did that? I mean, it's a little weird. I don't tell jokes. That's not the thing. It's to do something that feels funny. Oh, when you asked me what are the outcomes, and I said people are thin, famous, rich, and have good sex.
Yeah.
And you started to laugh.
Yeah. That sort of stuff.
Yeah. That was a moment in which I wasn't being silly. I was being playful.
Yeah.
And first, I enjoyed that myself. Secondly, in that moment, where the two of us are laughing, we actually went into the positive emotional attractor.
Right.
I mean, not that we weren't before, but
yeah.
that certainly got us in there as well.
Right. And other things you do that we've not talked about, or you encourage coaches that you train to do?
There are a number of things that have to do with how the person manages and handles themselves. I think mindfulness and emotional intelligence is very important, which means I think people have a responsibility to stay in touch with what's going on inside.
Yeah.
What drives them. I don't think people should do any of this kind of work unless they have a personal vision. It's like I say to leaders, you can't be inspirational unless you feel inspired.
Yeah.
So I think there's a certain amount of not just authenticity and genuineness about the process that's really important, but if you don't practice it, then how is it credible?
Yeah.
As I said before, I think doing research on this work and writing about it is very important, because if you don't, how are you testing whether or not the ideas are working. Those are some of the things. I mean, it'd be, since it's everything I do, it'd be kind of hard for me to say all the parts of it.
Right.
I think it's good to have meals together. I think it's, unless a person has an alcohol problem, it's good to have wine together.
Right.
I mean, there are a lot of things that help make the experience human.
Yeah.
When all is said and done, that's what it is. I mean, would we need coaches if people still had friends? No.
Right.
People don't have time for friends anymore.
Right.
I'm sorry, I'm oversimplifying it,
Yeah.
but really, an awful lot of what we're doing in coaching is what we used to do years ago with good friends. We'd sit over some wine and we'd talk, or coffee, and we'd chat about what each other's doing. We'd help each other with stuff. And usually the people we'd go back to are the people who made us feel better about the process.
Yeah.
But I think one of the reasons that coaching has blossomed is people are so overwhelmed with their family responsibilities, with all of the stuff with computers, and you're in constant contact with thousands of people, all of your Facebook friends and your LinkedIn friends, and so I think that's why people need more coaching. I also think that in many cultures, in Hofstede's terms, that have high power distance, where training is hard, because in Spain, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Japan, where people feel uneasy about disclosing in groups, coaching is a perfect way for them to seek development.
Right, yeah.
So I think coaching has taken off in many parts of the world, because since the 60s, when people have been trying to proselytize management training, it really offends a lot of the cultural sensibilities of people in many of those cultures, like I said, that have higher power distance.
Right.
It's not necessarily out of fear, some of it's out of respect, but whatever it is, people don't want to do it. But coaching is perfect. It's just you and I.
Right. You also mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned something about team coaching and peer coaching.
All of the things, I've been talking about here. So my intentional change theory is a complex system, so it's a multi-level. So I use the theory to explain how sustained desired change happens with an individual, with dyads, couples, pairs, manager, subordinate relationship, etc., doctor-patient, with teams, with families, with organizations, with communities, with countries, with global processes. So I think any of these things could be happening at any of those levels.
Right. And you also mentioned before being credible. Like, what would it take for a coach to become to have credibility?
Gray hair. Hair doctor. I think credibility comes in a number of forms. Part of it can be expert credibility, where you've got a doctorate. You've published things. And very often when people seek out a coach, they do it on the basis of reputation. Another form of credibility is the voice of people with whom you've worked. So I don't like credentialing. I think it's a foolish thing to do, and it institutionalizes mediocrity. But I think a person should be accountable for their impact. So when people say to me, I'd really like to work with a coach, but they're in a city or in a country where I don't know anybody that I could refer them to say, here's a good coach, or talk to this person, I'd say, talk to some of your peers and ask them who they turn to for help, and have they helped them. I worry that many of the people who are doing coaching aren't that good at it.
Right.
I'm not saying they're causing harm, but they're not necessarily adding value. I don't have any data on that, but I don't know. I mean, we don't do very good outcome research in coaching.
Right.
So part of my concern is, how does somebody pick somebody who's good? Talk to other people and find out, have you worked with somebody? I used to say this when I was training therapists, and somebody would say, I need to find a therapist. I'd say, talk to people, and I would only recommend people as a therapist to someone if I had seen the results of their work. And if on the whole, it doesn't have to be all the time, but if on the whole it helped people, then I'd say, okay, this is a good therapist.
Yeah.
I think it's the same thing with coaches.
Yeah. But in the coaching industry, there are a lot of people, organizations, but also like the ICF, EMCC, trying to create like
Credentials.
Yeah. And can you say something about your thoughts on that?
I think it's a waste of time. Credentialing as a sociological process in any profession always starts out by people wanting to maintain or achieve a higher quality.
Yeah.
Or consumer protection. And in every profession I've ever looked at, or other people have ever looked at, 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, all it's done is institutionalized mediocrity and excluded other groups.
Yeah.
So, on the whole, I think people's track record should suffice, not credentialing. So, do you go to a restaurant because the chef graduated from the Cordon Bleu, or because they graduated from the Culinary Institute of America in New York?
No.
No. How do you pick a restaurant? How do you pick a restaurant to go back to?
Yeah.
See? That's performance in context.
Right, right. And
now, I understand why ICF would become so popular, because people are wrestling with, how would I know if I'm good at it? You know, when organizations, I mean, now that organizations are trying to find coaches and they don't have networks of coaches, they need some way to say, well, who do I talk to?
Yeah.
I'm not casting any aspersions on ICF, but they're using input criteria.
Yeah.
They're not using output criteria.
No.
They're saying, did you take these courses? How many years have you been coaching?
Yeah, exactly.
How does that show that a person's effective?
And if someone wanted to build a different way of doing it, different system where you actually take output criteria, what would that look like?
It'd have to be outcome research.
And how can you do outcome research on a single person?
Well, you'd have to do it on a bunch of your clients.
Okay.
I could study a bunch of your clients, if you were a coach,
Yeah.
over a year or two and find out whether or not they've changed. Have they improved on their ideal self, their vision? Have they improved on their behavior?
Yeah.
Has your relationship improved? Now, if I just ask those questions and collect, I'm not going to ask the questions directly because everybody distorts, but if I collect the data in a credible way, now what I have to do is I have to be careful that that wouldn't happen just as a function of asking the questions.
Right.
So I have to have at some point comparison conditions or control groups to know that if people answer it this way, that's why retesting people isn't convincing evidence by itself. It helps people validate that something good is happening, but is it research evidence that a person or a program is effective? No, because just the retesting sometimes affects it.
Right, right.
Sometimes cognitive dissonance reduction makes people say, well, of course I've gotten better, I've spent all this time and money.
Yeah. So
I mean, look, how many people do you know who have spent years in psychotherapy and you're not sure it's ever helped them at all? Right?
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah.
So then the question is, that's why I'm saying, instead of trying to overly micromanage it,
Yeah.
and try to measure with more precision things that may not be precise, why not use nominations, recommendations?
Yeah. And that's what people already.
Yeah,
But
that's not bad.
No, no.
It's not bad. It's not perfect, but nothing's going to be perfect.
Right, right.
You know, it's like, well, physicians. Look how hard it is to find out. Now, I mean, you know, if something goes wrong and you have to pick a surgeon, do you go through the list of surgeons and see what their percentage of people staying alive is?
Well, it would be nice, but
Yeah, it would be, but you don't.
no.
So what we do is we ask around, see who seems to have a good reputation,
Yeah.
but nobody picks it by where they got their degrees.
No. No.
Nobody picks it by whether or not they've got 14 certificates from different institutes on their walls. You know, same thing with picking your lawyer, or picking your spouse,
Yeah.
or your partner.
But
You know.
there's a very strong movement within the coaching industry to kind of create these systems.
Of course there is. In the early 80s, when my Competent Manager book came out, which was an empirical study of the things that differentiate outstanding from less effective managers at different levels, The UK had a raging debate going on as to whether or not they should charter management, whether or not they should license managers.
Yeah.
And this certification movement was fascinating to me because I had reporters calling me in the US, and I had them doing interviews with me when I was in the UK from both sides of the argument. They thought that because of my work on the competencies, I could show how a person could credential someone. And yet what I was often saying, if they asked me, was, I don't think that's a good idea. Yes, these are the competencies that are key, but don't try to create a credential, because what happens, here's an example. When you try to credential a lot of people, you can't have the qualitative assessments. So when my friend, a neighbor of mine, writes a lot of books on chefs, and how chefs are trained. A number have been bestsellers, New York Times and all that. Michael Roman. He describes this Culinary Institute of America training program where they go for a year. Well, when they have their week of training on soups, actually multiple weeks, but one of the weeks on soup, and if one of the days they're doing a Thai soup, at the end of the day, the faculty member doesn't give everybody a multiple choice test to say, do you know the ingredients in Tom Yum Goong soup? And they don't hang a certificate on the wall that says, well, this person went through a week of training on soups. They make them make 6 bowls of Tom Yum Goong soup, and they bring the bowls to the faculty member. And the faculty member and the student smell them, they examine the broth, they taste them, they do all these things, and they critique them.
Yeah.
That's a good assessment.
Yeah.
Because it's in context.
Yeah.
Now, assessment in context means you're assessing outputs, the results of something. When you do certification movements, you're almost always assessing inputs.
Yeah.
How many years did you go to school? Where did you get your degree? Did you do an internship? How many years were you a coach? Did you do the 6-week training program? They're not saying, what are the affidavits from 60 people you've coached? Show me the videos of your coaching sessions. Now, in medicine, they sometimes do have clinical evidence. In dentistry, I know they do. And in those professions where they require you to demonstrate what you're doing as the basis for the certification, then I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
But that's not what people tend to do.
No, I agree.
So,
and what advice would you give to other people who are kind of new to this, who want to apply some of the research from positive psychology or your research into coaching that they already might be doing?
come to our programs here.
Yeah.
If they want truth.
Yeah. And other things they could be doing?
They could go to the Harvard coaching programs. No, I would suggest seriously that people who want to be coaches or want to be better coaches should systematically go through development experiences in different approaches to coaching on a regular basis. Even if they get enamored with one particular model, be careful. The more you increase your commitment to one approach, the less you increase your flexibility.
Yeah.
A colleague of mine showed that, Lisa Berlinger, with her doctoral dissertation. So what you have to do is be careful. And I think that you owe it to yourself to keep trying new things. I think that the issue of continuing education, continuing exposure to different approaches is really good. Conferences like the one at Harvard helps, not just because it's an academic conference, and there's some keynotes, but they're workshop sessions.
Yeah.
Going to things where you spend a week learning X person's technique for something or other is a good way to do it.
Right.
I think developing a lot of different certificates that you've been through things is a good way to check yourself. Am I staying current?
Yeah.
Am I considering alternatives?
Yeah.
Am I learning? I don't think it means you're credentialed, but I just think it means you're still active and hopefully flexible.
Right.